like, am I supposed to be speechless? What am I supposed to be here? Why can't you tell me?
If I was you, I would be speechless because I think you're being outclassed in every way possible. Everybody knows, as Republicans and Trump supporters, literally our entire ideology is based on hate and about Obama not being born in the United States. Am I right, Duck? Like, that's literally our entire ideology, right? So why we focus on trans
I
so
can give
much?
you, Rob, let me give you something to play off of. So
Okay.
here's my classical conservative take.
Okay.
And we don't have to spend a ton of time here, but a trans issue comes up or something about group rights, like women's rights or something.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, cool. Tell me about healthcare, right? I understand healthcare. If people are out in the marketplace talking about solutions, I want to make sure those are accessible. I want to make sure the United States is doing the right thing to be a leader in the world on that. If we're talking about employment law, same thing. Tell me what's happening. Tell me what corporations are doing right now so I don't have to deal with it. And if I can do something to assist those mechanisms, if I have to step in and write a law, I will do that. But outside of that, this is why I say the MAGA right and the new right, the woke right, is based on hatred, because people don't say that. People don't say that. They say, I don't even want to hear about it. I want to punch down, which that is the thing where I do not personally, as a liberal and as a classical conservative, I do not tolerate that.
Do you punch up?
Yeah, if it's required. I don't know what lawmakers know. When they tell us what they know and I don't agree with them, then absolutely.
How do you define in this context? How do you define up and down?
So I would say punching up is saying that, like allegations against Matt Gaetz or something were serious enough that the public deserved an accounting for that. Not just voters in his district, but people who look up to the Congress and trust these people to make laws, to, in some sense, pass over a budget that the executive presides over. We should know who's doing something like that. So that to me is a small example of punching up.
So, okay, you gave a specific example. Is it fair for me to intuit from that you're like criticizing politicians is punching up? Is that basically what you're saying?
Yeah, politicians, I think, like, I'm not for like far leftists, like being overly critical of you probably work with payers and stuff. I'm not for like being overly critical of healthcare executives or something like that. From my perspective, it's like, yeah, if that stuff matters, I'm more than happy. Let's have that conversation. In other cases, it's like, yeah, let's give that back to the people. I want to hear people talk about that in a casual setting. But what I don't want is, I don't want someone who's trans or who's gay or who is a woman who's getting a horse shot, or a man who's gotten the worst of the U.S. economy, sitting in chat, and they feel like someone is beating the crap out of them. For what reason?
Okay.
To what end?
So
that
then,
makes no sense.
I'm trying to understand your world.
No,
and you are saying that you would not punch down, correct? And it sounds like you're, based on your definition of the example you give as a politician, you tell me if I'm misrepresenting you. Punching up would mean people with some sort of power going after them, and punching down would mean people that are victims. And so you wouldn't punch towards, and by the way, we're using punch metaphorically. No one's calling for violence. We wouldn't go after people. Sorry, Sarah. We wouldn't go after people, right, that we view as victims, but we would go after those we view as having power. Is that fair?
Yeah, I'm less teleological too. So this is another difference between us, Rob, is one of the things that I would say is that, look, if you're in a position where you can either provide support or just shut the fuck up, and you choose to do otherwise, you are inviting the response that comes from that, right?
That's interesting. That's interesting, because it sounds to me then that you're saying sometimes you would punch down. That's what that sounds like. In fact, I would say to you, I've met you twice. I've met you twice to my knowledge, and both times you punched down. For example, can you tell me the institutional power that like an average MAGA voter that lives in rural America has? Because you punch at them. What's their power?
Their power is that they're based in hatred, right? They're saying that we as a group can influence the course of democracy because we hate people, because we hate the world.
So
So
you say,
that to me is a
so
very clear
previously,
example
when I
where
gave,
they're asking what happened, where they're
okay,
asking for a teleological response.
okay, so when I asked you to give examples of punching up and punching down, you gave the example of a politician, and we went through, and it seemed that you were like, yeah, because politicians have
Okay.
power. And like, please, let me finish.
Yeah.
And then punching down would be people that were victims. And as soon as I'm like, well, if we look at like institutional power, it turns out that a lot of people that are Trump voters are amongst some of the poorest people in the country, particularly those that live in rural areas. And you just change the definition and go, yeah, but I know that they're hateful, so that's not considered punching down. So in other words, just like every other good lefty, what you say is
So this
it's
is a,
okay for me to attack the people that I subjectively think are immoral, and I don't consider myself punching down and hold myself to the same standard that I hold other people to. Rank
this is a
hypocrisy.
difference of this is a small difference of opinion. Let me just land my plane on this. This is a small difference of an opinion. I don't consider when people go and are conducting public speech, I don't consider giving the correct response that no one else has done over the last 4 years an act of punching down. I'm unemployed. I haven't worked, and the context doesn't matter. I don't have institutional power. I don't have influence or sway. But what I can do incredibly well is tell someone that they have not researched their idea, they're being mean and nasty, and they can go where the sun doesn't shine. And I will say that many different ways if I have to. That's all I try and do.
Would you acknowledge that there was a massive problem with an overstatement of police killing unarmed black men in this country, and that in large part led to riots that we saw in 2020?
Oh shit.
Would you
Uh,
acknowledge that?
uh, Acknowledging, what would I be acknowledging?
Would you
exactly?
acknowledge the following fact? That in large part it was grossly
yeah.
overestimated how many unarmed black men were killed by police officer, and that had a big role in the riots that we saw in 2020.
Yeah. So, I think the question that you're asking me right now is hard to answer. I would
sure
say
it
that
is.
there wasn't a lot of transparency, and no, it's not. There wasn't a lot of transparency in how policing was done. There wasn't a lot of context into how community policing was supposed to be done. And so when we saw these events on the news and people thought about themselves or their families, and this is not just Black Americans, but Americans in general who have a place in their heart and in their chest for these types of issues. I would say that people took the opportunity to politicize something that was an institutional or security issue. And I don't agree with that. I'm not going to wholesale write off Black Lives Matter or people
Nonetheless, the people
responded.
like me that would have heavily criticized them for the damage that they were doing predominantly to minority neighborhoods based on a falsehood. You just told me, even if a group doesn't have institutional power, that if they have not researched their topic significantly, then you don't consider it
Sure.
punching down to tell the truth. So everyone that criticized Black Lives Matter for those things, you would say they weren't punching down, correct?
So that's a really good question, Rob. And the way I would answer that is that it wouldn't be my place as a commentator or pundit or private citizen to say what is impacting these communities the most at any given time. That's all I have to say to that.
Right. Well, I think it is my place. And again, it is evident to anyone listening that you just change your definitions to fit so that the standards that you want to impose on other people don't have to apply to yourself.
So I agree. Yes. Okay. And so if I'm going to concede something, it is that I do not want to be the person that has to decide the safety of Black Americans in my everyday life. I'm not someone that's equipped to do that. And so from my perspective, this aspect of justice, including free speech, including the right to organization or assembly, as well as whatever legal proceedings arose from this, right? You have the right to litigate against people. Of course, you can never condone criminality, but what is there in there to actually condone or to find reproachful, to find something distasteful even? I don't totally understand that.
I would say that it's clear that what's happening is that you basically have groups that you have an affinity for. And we can see this sort of archetype from people like the overbearing mother, right? Where the idea is you are a cultural Marxist or whatever name you want to call it, and that you view your in-group as victims, and therefore the ends
So
justifies
like
the me.
we're and
Please let me
we're
finish.
talking
I
about
said
Black
here,
Lives.
please. I
We're
said
talking
here,
about Black Lives Matter
Duck, you
protesters,
acknowledge that
right? You're not calling me.
I've been extremely patient, right? I let you talk unfettered, so you can give me the
Yes,
same respect. Okay. So it
exactly.
seems
Yep.
obvious to me that what's occurring is that you have this affinity for those groups and you think that they are victims of some sort of hierarchy, and therefore the ends will justify the means. And so when you're advocating for those groups, even if by objective
Okay.
measures you would be punching down by going after other poor
Yeah.
people, by the way, this is one of the things that we saw with the Black Lives Matter movement. It was the first revolution that was
Yep.
led by the top down. You had all these wealthy corporations like Nike and Chase Bank that were just saying Black Lives Matter, even though they've been accused of racist practices in the past. And who were they pointing the finger at? Well, they were burning down neighborhoods and inner city neighborhoods and pointing the finger at poor rural MAGA voters as if they were the problem. They weren't taking their protest to Martha's Vineyard. They weren't taking it to Barack Obama's neighborhood. They weren't taking it to Washington. No, instead they were protesting in inner city black neighborhoods, or they were protesting against poor rural whites. And it seems clear to me that you would embrace at least the idea of attacking those poor rural whites, because even though by any objective measure they would be considered punching down to go after them because they don't have power, you're okay with that because you view them as oppressors and evil and think that their very voting philosophy in the first place is only committed through hatred. So you're okay with it.
But
You don't hold yourself.
so
You literally are exactly what you accuse the others of doing. You hate them because you find them
you are,
immoral, so the standards don't apply to you.
you don't. Okay. You don't understand that you're proving a point that I would agree with right here, which is that Americans don't understand democratic socialism. They don't understand nations outside of the U.S. that are communist, that have more robust public ownership structures, and you don't understand how institutions in the United States work. You are conflating the most severe ideological positions, which most Americans don't hold, with somehow this black hatred, right? And so you're moving us back to like the year 1960 is what I see as you're doing, and then shifting the blame onto me. And so this is yet another example of when I say the MAGA movement is hateful. There's this inability to understand groups sort of, you can say lived experience if you don't like that. You can say their problems navigating modern American society. There's a difficulty of understanding what that is like from the group level. And so as a result, because of this, my interpretation is what you want me to do is say, well, MAGA's not hateful, they're in the right, and somehow they have, Black Lives Matter or people who are sympathetic to Trayvon Martin haven't clarified their position. And to me, that is the essence of creating a logical argument from the perspective of hatred.
So again, what you do is you say a lot of stuff, but it's sort of non sequitur to anything we've been talking about. I went through painstakingly, allowing you to talk the majority of the time to define your terms. You defined to us what you meant by punching up. You defined what you meant by punching down. You defined the terms up and down. You talked about the power structures. Then when pointed out the hypocrisy of that, because you actually do punch down, you added a caveat that you don't consider punching it down if the people that you're punching at are coming from a place of hatred. Then when asked, how do you define hatred? You said, well, because one of the things that you would say is because they haven't. Please let me finish. Please, let me finish. Please. Right? You said, well, another factor in this is when you find that people are uneducated and you are informing them of how they're incorrect, then you wouldn't consider that like against your standard. When I pointed out that Black Lives Matter itself was largely based on a lie, heck, we can go before Black Lives Matter. Hands up, don't shoot was a lie. Don't take my word for it. Take Eric Holder and the Justice Department's word for it that said that that was a lie. It led to riots. It led to predominantly black people's lives being ruined because their property was destroyed. When I say, well, therefore, I would have been legitimate and not held to the standards that you want to hold me to, and it wouldn't have been considered an act of hate because I'm just doing what you suggested you did, which was informing people that were ill-informed when they were publicly commenting. Not only were they publicly commenting, they were rioting.
Yeah.
They were protesting. Please let me finish. And so when I bring that up, your response to this, showing the logical conclusion that you're a hypocrite and that actually you're subjective in the way that you apply this stuff because you feel that you're morally superior, and you always say it's okay for you to break your own standards because the side that you're arguing against is immoral. You're just like, well, yeah, that sounds like logics and all, but you're just taking us back to the 1960s. That's not an argument. You just are declaring that
Rob,
I'm hateful.
Okay. Let me concede one point, is that I did jump to this point that MAGA is hateful. And so if I could walk this back, if I had to walk this back, what I would say is that in a democracy in the United States, we know that what we owe to that democracy is transparency. What we owe to that democracy is the same standard of justice for everyone. And when people perceive that that doesn't happen, their means of enforcing what justice is in the first place, of asking what we owe back to our democracy, is by standing up, it's by joining hands, and it's by protesting. It's by creating these public intellectual movements. And the point that I still cannot understand or grasp is, why is it the case that there doesn't seem to be shared ground? All I see in my head when you talk is burning cars, which I don't feel this is something that is emblazoned in Americans' minds. In fact, I think it's the opposite. In fact, I think more Black Americans and God-fearing white Americans are wondering, now more than ever, do I need to own a gun for the year 2030? Now more than ever, do I have to worry again about these radical federal and state level politics changing my kids' education? Now more than ever, how do I have to think about, me, a Black person in America, do I have to think about a police budget being cut in 2025 or in 2035? What's next? And this uncertainty is something that is totally missing from the perspective that MAGA is building these teleological arguments from the perspective of virulent and untenable hatred.
As much as I'd like this, Duck, stand by.
Well, allow me to retort. Right. So there's a lot I feel like we're two ships passing, because I feel that I'm trying to engage and actively listen to what you're saying and then responding to it. And I feel like that you just are going sort of with these empty platitudes based on the idea that you just at root cause think that I'm just a hateful person because of the way I vote. So a couple things that I'll say there in sort of the long-winded approach you had, which I don't blame you for being long-winded. I certainly am. You said that it's some sort of intellectual movement. I'm sorry. I failed to see how Black Lives Matter was an intellectual movement. Certainly there was some intelligence to it. For example, the grifters that led that movement and bought 5 or 6 houses. In that sense, I guess you could say they're just like the intellectuals that steal from poor young people and give them false educations, just indoctrinating them into left-wing things as universities become more and more expensive. In that sense, yes, I guess intellectual. So I guess I'll concede that point. But by no means was this some movement where it was people, please, let me fit, please,
That's a good
no,
point.
please,
No,
please,
it's too good of a
please,
point for us to pass up.
But you can
too good
address,
of a point
just
for
like
us
you
to
made
pass up.
5-6 points.
What do you learn at a university? Rob,
have a little
Rob,
decorum.
what do you learn at a university?
Have a
Rob,
little decorum.
What
you
do
can
you learn
ask me
at a
this question.
university?
Duck, have a little decorum. You could ask me this question when I'm finished making the point. I've sat here politely the entire time you've spoken and allowed you to make multiple points at a time. It's not my fault. It's not my fault that I'm capable of explaining and articulating all of the direct points that you're making, and you're incapable of doing that with me and feel the need to cut me off in addition to not being able to do it. Now, the next thing you said was, so I didn't find it to be intellectual. In fact, it's anti-intellectual. Most of the time, they're just, much like I feel that you do, just chanting slogans and talking points, and they're not actually having a discussion or anything of that nature. You talked about the idea of coming back together and holding hands and having this sort of movement. What I saw was riots, people that were coming together even when they weren't riot, and they were saying things that, quite frankly, many times were hateful, like pigs in a blanket, fry them like bacon, and other things like that. To the extent that there were people that were legitimately protesting them, my hat goes off to them. Every group should be able to protest any movement that they want. I, unlike you, wouldn't say because I disagree with the conclusions that they reach that I think they are hateful people, because I'm not interested in those sort of subjective labels to eschew the standards that I set forth with myself, unlike you. I would suggest that a person that is certain that they are morally correct and those that disagree with them are immoral probably themselves would meet most objective metrics of what evil or bad is. And so maybe you should look in the mirror before you describe those aspirations onto an entire political movement. In addition to that, you talk about, well, you'll have to own more guns. Good, you should own guns. The Second Amendment's great. You should learn to protect yourself first and foremost against government tyranny. That was the original intention, and everyone should be doing that. You talked about the idea of everyone wants equal justice. Agreed, couldn't agree more, which is why it's so absurd that we see the unequal justice is proffered by the highest level of our government, like the FBI, but somehow the same people that decry unequal justice when it comes to small individual police departments have no problem with the unequal justice justice that's given by the most powerful law enforcement agency in this country, which is the FBI. In fact, you need only look at the people that actually
Are you
engaged
close,
in.
Rob?
Please.
Rob, are you getting close?
Please,
Are
let
you
me
getting close,
finish.
buddy?
Why is it, Duck, that I could leave you talk unfettered and you feel the need to interrupt me? You talked at great length, I think, offering non sequiturs. I'm responding to all of your points. Take some notes or something, and then you could respond to them. Now, the point I was trying to make there is what we see is actually when you look at the people that engaged in violent actions under Black Lives Matter, oftentimes they were given sweetheart deals. They were allowed to engage in this violence over and over. They were called the Summer of Love. Hell, even the people in the Chaz Zone were giving financial support from people in the government there. If that would have been MAGA that did that, they would have been thrown in jail by insurrection hunters and had their entire lives ruined if they weren't spending 10 years in prison. The last thing you talked about was the idea of wanting equal justice. I agree. We should want equal justice, which is why I hope you join me in the unequal justice that was proffered by the FBI that did things like illegally spy on Donald Trump, went after MAGA supporters in the largest FBI task force in history, and intentionally protected them.
Okay, Rob.
Just like I'll
Rob,
finish on this. I'll
is
finish
10
on this
miles
point.
into the
Instead of you trying to be,
territory.
instead of you coming together as kumbaya to address the unequal justice that these people see, instead you just deem them as their issues don't matter. They aren't the victims of any sort of inequality whatsoever, and therefore even the poorest MAGA supporter that's in rural America, you could treat as if they are the powerful, and you're punching up because you subjectively feel they're evil based on your own proprietary definitions that justifies you doing whatever you want to them.
All right. And so, the counterpoint to everything you've said is that the United States has at least 100 really solid years of peaceful protesting, of Martin Luther King leading people to Washington, not rioters trying to spread Russian and American conspiracy website rhetoric and overthrow the government. And so the opposite of the fear mongering, which you're encouraging me to respond to, is that the main thing that Americans have to still look out for is that free speech exists, freedom of assembly exists, the fact, I wouldn't go as far as specifically talking about punching down specific MAGA voters or people who claim to be part of this MAGA movement as violent extremists, despite some of them having extreme violent anti-government tendencies. And so the fact that you are people that are either rightfully afraid or rightfully angry, or those that don't understand how to express what they see as extreme injustice, and you're characterizing them as terrorists, I think this is something that is an example of punching down, where what I'm trying to do is offer at least a platform for conversation that allows us to understand each other. I don't know what else I'm supposed to say. I'm honestly, am I supposed to be speechless? What am I supposed to be here? Why can't you tell me?
If I was you, I would be speechless because I think you're being outclassed in every way possible. I'll just say a couple things real quick. First is the idea that you're just going to continue to say, well, when my side does it, it's okay because they're doing it for good reasons. That is the definition of subjective. The other thing I'll ask real quick, just a question to you is, you talked about 100 years of peaceful protests. Let's take one organization. How about Black Lives Matter? Do you think there were a lot of instances of protests that were not peaceful with them?
I'm not aware of Black Lives Matter, having any special characteristic as a violent, they're not a terrorist organization. What do you want me to say about this?
I don't recall saying that they're a terrorist organization. I just asked, you seem to imply that the right wing, the MAGA people, were violent, right? And that's not what we should be. We shouldn't be violent because before that, we just had peaceful protests. So immediately preceding January 6th, we had a bunch of Black Lives Matter protests, a large amount of them. In fact, I believe according to a study that was done by Stanford that was used to cite that they were mostly peaceful, it said 93% were peaceful, which is good, but 7% weren't. And it said that there were, I believe, 212 locations of violent protests that occurred in the name of Black Lives Matter. Now, keep in mind, that's not 212 incidents, that's location. So in a place like Seattle that had 80 days of rioting, that would only count as one. So my question to you is, do you acknowledge that? Do you acknowledge that there were hundreds of locations in this country where there were Black Lives Matter protests that resulted in violence? Do you acknowledge it?
Rob, I think what you're trying to get me to do is the same teleological approach where you're trying to get me to say that.
Can you define teleological?
Yeah, so, existing for a purpose or having a function, you want me to say that Black Lives Matter protests existed to cause violence.
Okay. That's
where,
not what I said.
Where I don't understand or see why something like the Rodney King riots in LA, and we can go back in history and we can look at corporate riots, right? This is social democrats and Republicans protesting against unjust forms of
Doug,
labor.
you got to land this plane, man.
That's a plain landing right there.
Okay,
That
plain
is
landing. I'll be quick.
the
I'm not going to be
right
as
there.
wordy. But again, you've just said, okay, they were violent, but there was extreme injustice. You don't see the problem here. You're like, it wasn't violent, and then when I press you on it, you're like, well, of course there was violence, but it was okay because they were doing it for a good reason.
I think you're mischaracterizing what I said. You're trying to punch at me. We're talking punching down, left, right, up, center. Rob, I'm sorry. I don't know if I've lost the thread, but it seems like you've gotten into a rut here. And
let
I
me
have
help
But
you.
in fact,
as
now
the
I do have to
moderator.
get going. I will end it on this, and then you can say whatever you want, Grid. I will concede this. I am punching down.